Without further ado, please join me for what I'm sure will be a wonderfully stimulating session, and join me in welcoming Corinne, Bryan and Mary to Small Wonder. Welcome.
Thank you very much, and thank you very much to Charleston Small Wonder for inviting us here today, because it's always a treat to come to Charleston, so sort of any excuse. And I was delighted to be asked to chair this event, because I thought, oh, not only am I going to Charleston, but I'm also going to be interviewing Bryan and Mary Talbot. My name, as you've heard, is Corinne Perlman. I'm Creative Director at Myriad Editions, and we have a thriving graphic novel publishing programme. And I was delighted that Bryan Talbot was a judge of our inaugural first graphic novel competition a couple of years ago. Bryan and Mary are here today to talk about Suffragettes, which is their second book together. Mary Talbot, until very recently, was a prolific academic and publishing internationally celebrated for books such as Language and Gender. Bryan, and then you, now, is that right, that you retired in order to work on your first graphic novel with Bryan?
No, I retired because I'd had enough of higher education.
Okay, right.
On the teaching side, that is.
Yes, yes.
And management in particular.
Yeah. And meanwhile, kind of Bryan, for many, many years, I think officially over 30 years, has been one of the, I think he's possibly one of the most, if not the most celebrated UK comics creators for both words and pictures working together, and his celebrated graphic novels, the sort of the collected Luther Arkwright, I think, was your first really celebrated collection some years ago. You're also the author of The Tale of One Bad Rat, which was, I think, kind of one of the, that was actually kind of one of the first sort of works of, not graphic memoir, but biography of someone who had suffered abuse and so on. It's the most kind of beautiful, celebrated book, which put Bryan into a totally different market from Luther Arkwright. Alice in Sunderland was another totally different, groundbreaking book. I mean, Bryan just kind of changes everything all the time, and he breaks boundaries with everything he does. He has also sort of now kind of won international acclaim for the Granville series, and a new one is coming out in November. But when Mary and Bryan got together, and this is the real story, they began to, they worked together on Daughter of Her Father's Eyes, which was a biography of, both a biography of Lucia Joyce, the daughter of James Joyce, and also autobiographical. It was the story of Mary Talbot and her father, who was a Joycean scholar. And the two stories, the biography and the autobiography, interwove. And Mary, this was her first script that she had done as a comics writer, and Bryan did the artwork and the layouts and design. And then, lo and behold, they win the Costa Prize for biography. And there's Bryan beavering all these years. And Mary, his collaboration with Mary, launches him into the literary world.
Because it was the first graphic novel to ever win, in Britain at least, to win a literary prize.
Yes, yeah. Bryan, of course, has won many other prizes and has been nominated for the Eisner Awards and so on. Anyway, following on from that success, we come to Sally Heathcote, Suffragette. And this book came out in May, I think, and it has been equally as celebrated as Daughter, and has had sort of fantastic response in the press. And I'll just kind of read you a couple of reviews. This is what they said in The Independent. The beauty of graphic novels is their ability to communicate complex political ideas in a deceptively simple fashion. What could be a terribly interesting yet easily forgotten historical narrative becomes instead an engaging personal tale that haunts the reader long after the final page has turned. And The Guardian described the book. It's a book that combines an academic attention to detail with passionate politics. And in the programme here, it says quite justifiably, your work has elevated the graphic novel into a new literary dimension. So, now with all that preamble, let's get back to Sally herself. Mary, can you tell us a bit about Sally?
Sally Heathcote is actually a fictitious character, but she's embedded in solid historical detail. The setting that she's in and the people that she meets were real historical, figures and places. She's at the beginning, narrative terms, she's a maid of all work in the Pankhurst household in Manchester, and she's a sort of fly on the wall figure who sees the very early beginnings of the Women's Social and Political Union, which was the WSPU, which the Pankhursts set up in 1903. She's there in the background making the tea and putting the coal on the fire and so on while these things are going on. But she, as the story goes on, she becomes involved. She learns the whole point of what it is they're trying to achieve. She learns about the socialist roots, that the WSBU had at the beginning and so on, starts to understand what the issues are, and she becomes involved. She gets, without telling the story, of course, she becomes one of the people in the sort of rank and file who makes leaflets and chalks pavements and embroiders badges and so on. And eventually she becomes one of the more frontline people who's out there in the street demonstrating and heckling and so on.
Yeah.
And she becomes increasingly radicalised as the story goes on until she becomes one of the young hot bloods who are the people responsible for direct action. So I think that makes it quite timely, really.
Yeah. In fact, this was Daughter of Her Father's Eyes was it was fictionalised biography and autobiography, as it were. This book is actually Sally Heathcote is herself a fictional character, but the whole book is kind of peppered with the biographies of many of the women who took part in the suffragette movement. First I'd like to ask kind of why you chose to write about the suffragettes in the first place.
My academic background was always, in one way or another, involved with exploring gender politics. I mean, I taught courses on language and gender and took courses on media discourse, looking at gender representation and so on. And I was very much aware of not knowing enough about the history of feminism. And when I was in a position to be able to do something about that, when I took early retirement, I started thinking, well, actually, when I'd finished the work on Daughter of Her Father's Eyes, I was able to think, okay, what's next? I've been bitten by the bug. What shall I work on next? And I started looking into some of the history of feminism and realised I didn't know very much at all about the suffragette movement, and decided that was something that I would very much enjoy immersing myself in, and maybe I would get a story about it, out of it. And of course, I very readily got a story out of it because there is so much. I had no idea that it was such a massive movement. There were so many different facets. The WSPU was very relatively small. There were many other movements, and it was national, international. Once I got a sense of the scope of it and some of the characters, I realised that was what I wanted to write about next.
I mean, it's an amazing achievement to have managed this kind of vast canvas of characters the way you have. And I was, as I was reading it, I was struck with how you were, how you orchestrated that and kind of brought some of the characters into the front. And there are people who I had never heard about before, who were kind of clearly heroines of the hour. I mean, to be honest, I'd only heard of Emmeline Pankhurst and Christabel Pankhurst, and I was a bit unclear of everybody else. But there's this couple, the Pethick Lawrences, who practically kind of funded the whole of the suffragette movement.
They did, yes. I mean, I hadn't heard of them before either. I mean, Fred and Emmeline Pethick Lawrence were the kind of backbone of the Women's Social and Political Union when they joined it in 1907. They were asked, Emmeline was asked to come and be their secretary, their fundraiser, and she said no initially, but she couldn't bear to disappoint them, so she agreed. You realise they had absolutely no fundraising abilities, no organisational sort of experience whatsoever, and they ended up, she and her husband, who was a man of inherited wealth, they ended up bankrolling the whole thing until they were booted out in 1912. They were the key organisers, along with Christabel Pankhurst. The three of them were this sort of triumvirate that ruled the WSPU. Mrs. Pankhurst, the elder Emmeline Pankhurst, was more of a figurehead than one of the organisers. So it was the three of them, the two Pethick Lawrences and Christabel Pankhurst, who were the ones who were these autocratic, really, leaders.
Yeah.
But, I mean, yes, I was particularly struck by the cruel ousting of them in 1912. There was this coup within the WSPU and this major split as a consequence. And that was what struck me as being such a striking thing. I mean, they were doing wonderful things, what they were achieving, but of course there was sort of internal strife in the union as well. And it was such a powerful moment in history that I thought that was a really good place to actually enter the narrative. So the main part of the story enters with Fred and Em Pethick Lawrence returning from Canada, where they'd been recuperating from a stint in prison over the summer, to discover that they'd been ousted from the union. That's where the story breaks at the beginning.
Yeah.
But there's so much, there's so many different characters. I was aware, as you say, that I couldn't cover all of it. And having Sally Heathcote as this little figure dropped in meant that she could see a lot of things from lots of different perspectives. Whereas if I'd stuck with, for example, Emmeline Pethick Lawrence's story, it would have been much more restricted to one route through the feminist history.
Yes, it's. I should also bring in here virtually an introduction to the third author involved in the book, because, of course, Bryan, on this particular book, you were the timing of it was rather unfortunate because you were hard at work on one of the Granville series, and so you did all the kind of the layouts and the design, and obviously worked with Mary in the planning of the book. But then the brilliant illustrator, kind of Kate Charlesworth, well, illustrator and cartoonist, was. Can you tell how did you sort of decide on Kate? I mean, my theory is that there was some discussion about Kate entering in the first graphic novel competition. We saw an amazing piece of work that she'd done, and I feel it was that sparked off. It's got to be Kate to illustrate this book.
No, I've known Kate for about 20 years, and when we were trying to think of an illustrator who could do it justice, I mentioned Kate early on, and I thought, well, hold on, she's a bit cartoony. Her style's a bit too cartoony for it, and I started looking at some of her work, and then I saw this illustration she'd done of Virginia Woolf at home, and I thought, that's the style we want for Sally. And Kate's, I did actually mention it to Kate when I met her about a year before, and she said, oh yeah, I'd be interested in doing it. So when I finally came to her and said, would you like to do it? She said, yes, I've been thinking about it, you know. And as it turned out, she drew Sally in a different style again. But a style that really suited the story. It really captures the Edwardian era, because she's a buff on this sort of stuff. She knows all about it, knows all about the era. She was a suffragette enthusiast anyway. So she was great. So, as Corinne said, I'd already started the next my series of Granville books, sign the contract and everything. So I said, well, what I'll do is I did all the lettering and the page layouts and basically the storytelling in rough. I did it all in, I did all the panel compositions and everything. So basically I was the director, if you like, and then Kate came in and did the finished, polished artwork on it. She did a
So I
fantastic
suppose
job.
I was the script writer then.
But did you, going back to the script writing bit, did you, I mean, you know, and people are always a bit interested about your working methods, whether you sort of, you know, like you arrange to meet over a cup of milky coffee at about 11 a.m. or something and swap notes. I mean, how was did you do the book on your own without discussion?
There was a complete script, yes,
Yeah.
and I'd broken it down page by page and panel by panel. So there was, it was more or less set once I'd done that.
I mean, while you were working on that, you know, while you were writing the script, we'd be discussing it over the dinner table and stuff
Yeah.
like this. But yeah, basically I was presented with the script. And one of the things I also did was I was a script editor as well. I was suggesting, you know, I think you should drop, you don't need this sentence, you can drop it. Because in comics, you're very limited with space. So if you can say the same thing, only condense it, it's a real plus. So I was doing a bit of script editing as I went. Because Dan, our editor at Cape, Dan Franklin, he's very hands-off as editor. He either accepts a script or he doesn't. And that's the end of his editorship, you know, which is good, you know, in a way. But so we're
take a note out of that.
self-edit the things.
Yeah. Can you, as far as the you know, the fact that there's the fictional character and you've spent so much time as an academic, did you find that aspect, was it more difficult to write in a fictional character than to base it on a real life person?
It was quite liberating, actually.
Right,
It was though I'd
yeah.
given myself permission to make it up, but I mean, I was only making it up in a very focused and specific and purposeful way. But yes, it was very enjoyable.
That's really interesting. So do you see that you might, I mean, because Bryan's fictions are just absolutely amazing. I've read very, very quickly the advance copy of the Granville series, which I'll pull out now, Bryan, and I haven't, it's the only copy available.
Yeah, it's the fourth one out in November. And basically they're anthropomorphic steampunk detective thrillers. So it's, I mean, my grandmother always used to say, you can't go wrong with a badger with guns, you know, this is a...
Anyway, yeah, we'll get back to that in a moment. You know, I know he's dying to talk about it. But the idea of making fiction and so on, because you've had so much experience of that. I mean, do you think you will do more fiction in the future, or are you kind of thinking of more? Are you still sort of, biographies are still what inspire you, people's actual stories?
Currently, I'm interested in working with biographical material, yes. I mean, I think it's an interesting way of exploring history for me. I mean, I've still not done enough of it to be bored with it yet. I mean, this is to me, the new thing to be doing. Yes. Rather than writing relatively dry, scholarly, you know, academic textbooks and so on, to be writing stories is lovely, and I'm enjoying the biographical side too. Yeah.
And I'm actually drawing now Mary's third book, which
we're
is
talking about that.
Well, no, I'm not going to say what it's about.
Yeah, but you will be. But I mean, you were. I mean, the fact that kind of Kate was the third person in this, and obviously you worked really well with her, and I think that was a very happy collaboration. But actually, you'll be very pleased to get back to working together again and doing the whole thing. Yeah.
People are sometimes surprised that we get on together working. You know, I mean,
that's what I'm trying to. I'm trying to kind of get some. You know.
Yeah. Well, it's just, we've been married for 40 years now. It's just like a continuation of everyday life, isn't it? Really. Yeah.
It feels as though it's a perfectly natural thing to do. I don't know. As a matter of fact, it's quite nice to both be focusing on the same thing work-wise, because, I mean, if anything, in the past we've been, well, obviously we've been competing for the major resource of time, and to actually be focusing on the same thing and wanting to get the same thing done is quite it's quite an easy flow, really.
Yeah. This is the Short Story Festival, and one of the descriptions of the graphic novel in the programme was that every page of a graphic novel is, in a sense, a kind of a short story that's a sort of compressed short story. And I sort of wonder if you could talk a bit about that and like talk us through sort of how you might create one of the pages and so on, because in some of the things in Sally Heathcote Suffragette, sometimes there's so much going on so many levels. There's the kind of the history going on, there's something in the background that's happening, there might be text in the panel. Could you talk a bit about the...
I think that's one of the great things about comics as a medium, is that you can convey a lot of complex information very simply and very directly using a mixture of words and pictures. One of the reviews of Sally, it said something like, if this is so rich, the story, and there's so much detail in it, and because you have to imagine that the illustration takes the role of descriptive passages in a prose book. And the review said, in another form, it wouldn't have been as easily digestible, all this information. But you can just convey a lot of information very simply, very directly by this mixture of words and pictures. Because you take it in through two channels simultaneously. I've heard it said that, I don't know if this is true, but it engages both halves of your brain at the same time. I don't know what the scientific basis of that is, if anything. But you do take it in.
Both of them,
yeah, you do take it in through the different channels. You read it. You're reading the text and you're reading the images, and they require two different ways of perception. I've heard academics call it multiple literacy, and because you just take it all. You just take it in the panel that you're looking at. You take in all the page as well, and the page facing it. You can't help it. You're sort of absorbing it while you're reading it. It's what the French call glissage. You're sort of skating over the thing.
But you can do things with the medium that can make very kind of lumpy, if you like, material more accessible. For example, there's a scene where all the different suffrage leaders have finally been permitted a meeting with the Prime Minister and the Chancellor of the Exchequer. And it's something which my source was the Votes for Women newspaper, and it was I think 3.5-page, very dense text article, pages and narrow column inches. It was turgid, to be perfectly honest. And yet this was my verbatim account of what went on in this meeting, which I wanted to have in. I thought, this is impossible. I've got to lighten this up somehow. What am I going to do with it? And here it is, by wonderful coincidence. So I thought, well, what can I do to make it more engaging? Oh, I know what. I'll have the Prime Minister and the Chancellor turning into cats, and I'll have the women leaders of the various organisations turn into mice. And that'll bring it to add a bit of interest to it, it'll add another level to it. It'll also add a level of interest, and I still had to have the dialogue, which wasn't in sound bites by any means. I mean, they could really talk for England, those people.
But it's also
very pompous sort of
it's
style.
a reference to the Cat and Mouse Act,
Yes.
which was this pernicious Act of Parliament passed to when suffragettes were released from prison because they were too weak because of the forced feeding and everything. It enabled them to grab them and bring them back into prison again as soon as they weren't well. So it's a reference to that as well.
Yes, the Cat and Mouse Act, yes.
Yeah.
The prisoners' release on ill health bill or something.
I mean, perhaps you can also talk about the choices that you made. I mean, mostly you're working on a 9-panel grid here for the design. And, I mean, we'll have a look at Bryan's artwork in a moment, some of his other things, but this is actually, there's quite a simplicity to Sally Heathcote, and also to Daughter of Her Father's Eyes. Why did you decide to do these books in this particular way? They're mostly, they're not black and white, but they're not full colour. The colour is used sparingly. Could you sort of talk us through the colour choices that you made?
For this book, Mary decided on the 9-panel grid. because it's a very accessible way of telling a story. It's obviously which panel to go to next, and you can set up a sort of beat with the different panels. It's what the stand-up comedians call timing, or musicians call rhythm. You can set up this sort of beat with each panel is a beat in the story. Also, it's very sort of harmonious on the eye because a 9-panel grid, it's in direct proportion to the page size. It's smaller. But Mary came up with that, and she used it in the prison sequence, which you'll see coming up, to really great effect. And this is something you can only do something like this in comics. When, as you can see, there's an ultimate white background on most of the pages here, apart from when the illustrations bleed off the page. But when Sally gets sent to prison, the background of the page darkens on the page she's going in there, and at the bottom of the page we go into a 4-panel grid at the bottom, and then we turn over the entire prison sequence, which is told over, what, 8 pages, 10 pages? 10, something like that. It's all on a solid black background with an 8-panel grid, so it's 4...
But they're very long,
yeah, 4
panels.
Narrow panels in 2 tiers. And this just gives the effect of looking through prison bars in this sequence. And also it makes it very claustrophobic because the actions are squeezed into these narrow panels. And it really becomes oppressive. And you can see, you know, going through the passage of night and day and time going on as she starts a hunger strike. And then when we get to the force feeding scene, which literally, I mean, it was torture, it was punishment for daring to, you know, do these acts of defiance. We really slow time down. We slow time down to small pieces of time to make it really excruciating, that sequence. And it's a sequence that's most of the reviews comment on, and it just worked really well. And I said, me and Kate were traumatised by it, you know. And by the time we started on the next section, when she's released from prison, it was a relief to both of us. And we kept them, because one of the things you can do with comics is you can encapsulate a whole atmosphere between 2 pages, like this. And you save reveals and you save changes in atmosphere when you turn the page. So when you turn the page and it's suddenly all white again, and we're on the 9-panel grid, which is in a very open panel to start off with, it's a relief. It's almost a physical relief. So it's just using the medium to its best advantage.
Yeah. And did you, the actual size, the size of the book, it's quite compact, so it's more like you know, some of the comic books are slightly larger format and so on. Was that also a deliberate thing to kind of keep the size down so that you could stick it in your handbag?
Yeah,
Yes,
yeah.
handbag size.
Handbag size.
Yes,
It's good, and I think it suits the story.
Yeah.
It suits the stories. Whereas the Granville books, I'm going after a sort of European model, and also I wanted Granville to look like an old, you know, children's annual sort of book, and it's embossed and everything. I know it's for adults, but
Yeah.
I wanted it to look like these old children's annuals because it's following in this children's anthropomorphic story tradition.
Yeah. I wanted to, one thing that I'd mentioned to you before this was that as I said, I only knew about kind of Emmeline Pankhurst, really. My knowledge of the suffragettes was almost entirely, I think we've got a few slides from this, but in my Girl Annual, which I read Girl Annual avidly. And this was my education about the suffragettes. There's a story about Emmeline Pankhurst here. I don't know if, Jay, you can find the Pankhurst thing, but it's actually, funnily enough, it's not dissimilar, and it's a short story.
I think I just saw Belle of the Ballet then, which is actually
yes,
referred
Belle
to
of the
in
Ballet
Daughter of a
and so
Father's
on,
Eyes.
yes.
Yeah.
But it's like rather wonderful kind of black and white wash illustrations and so on. And this was here it is in the back here. And this was my education. So it was, that's why it was a particular delight to read this book and to actually see all these other women who were involved and who had such kind of important roles and yet have never actually been, you know, particularly the Pethick Lawrences, they're just not in the public knowledge. And And yeah, do have a look at the book later. There's 20 pages, or more than 20 pages of notes at the end, which is very impressive. And I'm sure people would have believed you, Mary, even without them, just with the sources. But the notes are fascinating as well.
Well, that was also a way of squeezing more in and satisfying my sense of that sort of completeness, having to get everything right and making sure it's all out and above board and people can go and check it out, and, you know, but I've got my facts right. You know, it's the academic through and through, I'm afraid.
Anyway, I wanted to go on a bit more to kind of discuss the graphic novel and the ascendance of it. And it'd be nice to, can we possibly show the Talbot Gallery slides, please?
Before you did that, I didn't answer one of your questions, which is about the use of colour.
Oh, yes.
And we decided right at the beginning to use a very limited colour palette on it. And at first we were just going to use the WSPU colours, you know, the purple, white and green, as you can see on Mary's
I'm actually wearing an antique
brooch here.
Flag brooch from 1909.
But when I was laying out the story, it occurred to me that it's a cast of dozens and dozens of women in this story, all with sort of similar Edwardian hairdos and all in sort of similar outfits. And I thought, Sally needs to stand out. You need to see Sally whenever she appears. So I said, let's give her red hair. And that way, immediately, you see where she is. Even there's some panels and the marches with thousands of people in them, but you can see Sally, you can see the bit of red there. Oh, there's Sally. It's what we call the Rupert Bear effect, because any Rupertan, you can see where Rupert is immediately by his colours. And then Kate spontaneously said, oh, that's a good idea, and started colouring. Every time you see Mrs. Pankhurst, she's in sort of purple. And she gave Emmeline Pethick Lawrence's, she made that brown. So we started using colour to bring attention to things for effect. You know, we have blood, it would be red, and so forth. There's a bit where she's in a gaslit room, so that's sort of, you've got a yellow tint over it. So that, anyway, just to answer your question on that.
Yeah, thank you. Sorry, I'd forgotten I'd asked it.
Oh, these are Kate's notes here.
Yeah. So great. Okay, this is we'll go back to Sally at
this
the
is
end.
where I started. It wasn't 30 years ago. It was 40 years next year. I was doing British Underground comics.
Yeah, so kind of Bryan is very kind of celebrated for all manner of comics, and I can you talk a bit about what this, you know, working together on these two books, and you know the fact that we're here at the, you know, a literary festival and so on. I mean, obviously you've been a celebrated guest over the years at comics festivals internationally and also in the UK. Can you sort of tell everybody a bit about kind of what the comics world is now, because that's the relatively recent thing, and clearly the winning the Costa Prize for Dotter, I mean, even to the, you know, in the comics world, we recognise that something different was happening.
Well, comics, I mean, especially in this country, not as much in France, where they're sort of widely accepted and read. I mean, 1 in 8 books in France sold as a graphic novel. Over here, all the first British comics, going back to the broadsheets of the 17th century, through the Victorian comic supplements to newspapers, all the way up to the 19th century, end of the 19th century, they all had one thing in common. They were all for adult readership. They weren't actually made for children. And British children's comics were invented in 1890 by Alfred Harmsworth, who made a fortune doing it. And suddenly the market was swamped with thousands of, they sold millions, these children's comics, and they replace adult comics, basically. And that's why here we have a strong notion of comics being a children's medium. And it took until the 1960s, when the underground comic artists in America, the comics of the counterculture, they sort of reclaimed comics as an adult medium. And it's that led directly to the graphic novels of today. And the term graphic novel's been around. It was bandied about in the 60s, but there were no graphic novels produced, really. But there was a talk of a graphic novels, and the term came about. And in 1976, Will Eisner, the veteran American comic artist and writer, he produced a graphic novel called A Contract with God. And that was the first one to use graphic novel as a marketing term, to use it. And that's what it is. That's all it is, graphic novel. Some people say, what's the difference in comics and graphic novels? It's simply comics just means the medium, or the sort of pamphlet comics. It's all sequential art, if you like. Graphic novel, it's just a marketing term to describe comics in book form. There's no pretension about it. I mean, it's a misnomer for a start, but no more a misnomer than the term novel is to describe novels. But in the 80s, they suddenly became, people were doing more and more of these graphic novels, and they suddenly came to the public attention. And there was a huge boom in the mid-80s, spearheaded by 3 books, Art Spiegelman's Mouse, which dealt with his father's experience in Auschwitz during the Second World War, and 2 superhero books. One was Watchmen by Alan Moore and Dave Gibbons, and Dark Knight Returns by Frank Miller. And suddenly, you know, newspapers and magazines were having stories, you know, splat pow, comics aren't for kids anymore. And for a while, comics were cool, and adults were started reading them. But at that time, once you'd read about a dozen of the best ones, that was it. And comic companies jumped on the bandwagon and started slapping together 6 issues of Spider-Man and putting it out as a graphic novel. And there wasn't enough quality material to sustain this boom. But since then, they've been coming out in exponential frequency. I mean, now you can't read them all. There's so many. So by this point, we have a whole range of stuff. We have a whole canon of quality work in every conceivable genre, every conceivable style, from sort of abstract to photorealist. And now there's enough graphic novels around to sustain this boom, and I think that's why they've been increasingly accepted as a legitimate art form. And now, I mean, graphic novels have been the biggest growing area of fiction for the last 6 or 8 years in this country and in America. So it's increasingly becoming accepted as a legitimate way of reading stories, or anything. I mean, or biographies, and there's people like Joe Sacco, who virtually single-handedly invented the genre of reportage in comic form, and he'll do very serious pieces of journalism in graphic novel form that won awards and everything. Mouse, by the way, that was the first comic to win a Pulitzer Prize. I mean, you couldn't imagine a comic doing that before. But yeah, it's a growing audience. I think partly is today a lot of graphic novels are being written and drawn by women, so that's bringing a lot of women readers into the field.
It's now normal for there to be a graphic novel presence at literary festivals, which is certainly a recent development. I mean, we're asked to go to literary festivals rather than to the sort of comic convention type events, which is a very, very pleasing development, I have to say.
Yeah, I mean, Bryan, you're a patron of the Lakes Comic Art International Festival.
Yeah, so's Mary.
You're both patrons, joint patrons.
Founder patrons, yeah.
And that's really interesting, because this is in Kendal. It's the 2nd year, and it's happening in October, and the whole town is taken over with comics. There are events. There's panels, there's displays in the shop windows, and processions, and a comic marketplace, and so on.
The library, the art centre, the galleries, they all take place in the shops.
It's completely women-led. I don't think there's, the Julie Tato is the organiser, and I think most of the people she's working with. And it is an extraordinary achievement, and it is fantastic to see how many women. I must say that I think, Bryan, you've always been, especially with, how long ago did you do The Tale of One Bag?
20 years ago. Yeah.
20 years ago, and that's a real kind of, that's a feminist book. I mean, actually, your sympathies have always been very much there, and it's great to see that you're kind of collaborating like this now. And,
but in Europe, they've had these festivals since the 60s, where you take over a town. We've had comic conventions and marts in this country for 40 years or so, but they're very narrowly focused on superhero comics, solely for fanboys, superhero comic fans. Whereas in Europe, you have these big comic festivals like Angoulême that gets 250,000 people there. I mean, that's still a lot. 250,000 people there every year.
It's covered by like national television, isn't
Oh, yeah,
it? The
national
Minister of
television.
Culture goes there and opens it.
Every year, the national newspaper, Libération, has a pull-out Angoulême supplement, you know, telling you what's on at the comic festival. We've not got to that stage yet in
Well, I
this
think
country.
Kendall is trying to make the lead there. So do you feel that you can, I mean, you're obviously a great promoter of comics, and you're also a mentor as well. There was, I don't know if anyone was here, was the Brighton, the graphic novel was by Queen's Park, which was published by Queen's Park, a Brighton-based publisher. And that was stories about Brighton. And I think the people behind that had seen Brian's work that he'd done on Alice in Sunderland.
Yeah, it
and
was
wanted
inspired
to,
by Alice in Sunderland. That's why they asked me to do the cover.
And so
of it.
Brian was mentoring, and I think you do have this role of mentoring and promoting. I mean, and obviously now with Mary, you're both doing that and spearheading into, which is not bad. I'm not even sure that if you read any graphic novels, Mary, before you started writing them yourself.
Of course I did.
Okay, good.
I used to be limited as to what I could fit in to my reading time when I was working full-time in higher education. But yes, of course I did.
Yes, yeah.
But it would tend to be selectively. Brian would say, I think you might like this one, Mary. Try this one.
Yeah.
Because
Add
there
this to your
used to be
pie.
very few that she'd be interested in, you know.
Yeah.
I mean,
I
you
think
wouldn't like to
that's
see
true.
the new Daredevil
Yeah.
graphic novel or anything like that, you know.
No,
Exactly.
no,
I mean,
thank
there's the explosion of. I mean, that's what we have. There's now the content, so that there are. There's the content that people want to read that it happens to be in a graphic novel form. So instead of people having to say, oh, I don't know that I can read a graphic novel, they might say, oh, I would love to read a book about the suffragettes, and oh, it's a graphic novel, and getting in that way. Anyway, I think this is, at this point, we should probably see if we have any questions in the from the audience, who I can hardly see in this slide, but if I go like that, I can. Is there... would anyone...
Perhaps they would put the
Oh,
lights.
yeah,
for
that's
this.
even better. Yes. Yeah. Yeah. Yes, gentlemen.
I'm just very interested to ask you.
Is-
Oh, great. Okay.
I'm just very interested to ask you. You mentioned Spiegelman and Joe Sacco. To what extent do you find your style influenced by other graphic artists, or even artists from outside the graphic world?
Well,
Like any writer, you sometimes feel influenced by other writers.
Yeah, I like such a range of comic artists. I've been influenced by all sorts of people, from Jack Kirby onwards, you know. And I mean, Leo Baxendale, I think he was a huge influence. He used to, you know, he invented Bash Street Kids and Minnie the Minx. I used to love those a little. And Alfred E. Bestall, who did the Rupert the Bear books. I mean, the Rupert the Bear sort of style was a big influence on The Tale of One Bad Rat, because it's so clear, the storytelling in it. So I sort of use that sort of clear line style for that. But I always sort of adapt the style to suit the story I'm working on. But I mean, Hogarth was a big influence. William Hogarth on the Luther Arkwright book, and Gustave Doré, these old illustrators. So I tend to sort of absorb them. I can't really answer the question, because when I look at my work, I can't really see it. But I know when I first started drawing Dotter, Mary looked at the first page where she's on it, and she said, "Oh, you've made me into Posey Simmons' character." And I looked at it, I went, yeah. Other people said it looks a bit like Redmond Briggs.
Actually, I
style.
said, oh my God, I'm a Posey Simmons character.
Yeah.
With dots for eyes.
Yes,
Thank you very much. First of all, I wondered if, I'm sure you find there's a big gender divide in graphic novels and interests. I'm thinking of Persepolis, which was very attractive to new women readers, and Posey Simmons, of course, is a very great example. The other thing I wondered, a lot of these very successful graphic novels have been turned into films. What is happening to your wonderful graphic novels? Are you thinking about it? Has somebody approached you?
There's actually a film coming out called Suffragette being made at the moment, so that's scuppered the chances of Sally being made into one, I think. No, there's been attempts in the past. I mean, twice two sets of different people at the BBC have tried to make Tale of One Bad Rat into a TV film. There's been several attempts to get a Luther Arkwright movie off the ground.
There's been expressions of interest about Daughter of Her Father's Eyes, which have come to nothing. Not quite sure how that would work, to be honest. We did sort of hope that Sally Heathcote might attract interest, but as Bryan pointed out, there's a film being made called Suffragette, so there won't be another one.
I mean, I think quite often adaptations aren't necessarily successful. I think the adaptation of Persepolis, the film of Persepolis, was incredibly successful, but that's because Marjane Satrapi was like absolutely working on it with the film company, and it really had such integrity, and it was different from the book, but I have to say as good it really was. I mean, that was an incredible achievement. I forgot the first half of your question was about yes, yeah.
As I said before, I think these women creators, and there's more and more of them now, in fact, they're attracting a lot more women readers, you know.
Mary, you were, I mean, Ladies Do Comics, you were a guest of Ladies Do Comics. That's a very influential platform, isn't it?
I'm constantly impressed by the energy, the range and energy of women who are working in comics in all sorts of different ways these days. You know, I mean, I didn't know until I started making a point of finding out that there were so many women, not just young women, women of all ages with all kinds of different interests. Yes, I mean, it's very, very diverse.
Yeah, and particularly, I mean, somewhere like the Lakes Festival, I mean, it just felt totally equal, the number of people. And even, I mean, I've noticed going to the more sort of conventional comics trade fairs where, you know, you do see more of the, you know, superhero or kind of people dressing up in costumes and so on. There are a lot of families there now. I mean, that is much more mixed than I, you know, remember it being. It really has, you know, just as Bryan said, there are more, you know, more things happening. So, someone else with a question there? Yeah.
I'm just really interested in collaboration, and I know there's a long tradition of collaboration in comics, and you've touched on the who does what, and Mary did the script, and Bryan, you were outlining the pages. And looking, as we've been seeing these lovely pages while you've been talking, that you talked about the discipline of the 9-panel grid. And what was really striking, as well as the prison scene, which works brilliantly, and when you read it in the book, is how sometimes you have like a full or almost a full bleed with like a couple of inserted panels. And just coming from a background, you know, I'm much more familiar with prose than I am with graphic novels, but the different rhythms of that is really interesting, what it does to the page and what it does to how you read it. And I just wondered, if Mary, you said you did the script first, at what point is that a collaboration? Or Bryan, are you reading the script and then, then deciding how to present it?
Interpret it visually, yes. Because they're very useful, those sort of scenes like this, because it's sort of setting the scene, it's going behind the other panels, and you fill in what's there in your mind. You know, what is behind these other panels, or what is off page. But as for the collaboration, usually in the comic industry, especially the superhero comic industry, the collaboration is this: the writer writes a script, it gets sent to the artist, and the artist draws it. That's the end of the collaboration, usually. With our books, as you can imagine, we're living in the same house, we're seeing each other every hour, at least. So it was ongoing, the collaboration.
I try not to sort of sit on his shoulder while he's doing a page.
But so I'd be drawing it, and Mary's making suggestions for the artwork, and at the same time I'm translating it into images. I'm seeing how the text fits in, and suggesting, perhaps that sentence could be clearer, or we don't need that sentence, etc. So it's two-way. It's a very intensive two-way collaboration.
I wanted to ask you actually about the short story medium itself. I mean, have you, you always seem to be working on kind of longer books. Have you worked on short stories? Is that a form that you're comfortable with, or you've got the opportunity to work longer, so you?
Yeah, I tend to think in longer stories, and I have done shorts mainly written by other people, but I have written some myself. But in fact, I did it wasn't a story, but it was a thing about comics. I did a 2-pager this year for the Author magazine, because I was asked to do something to explain comics to people, in comic form.
And Mary, you scripted a short story, or you scripted a chapter for a...
I recently scripted a short 3-page satirical piece, actually, for a satire anthology that's coming out before the next election. It's political satire, which my son Alwyn illustrated.
Because I think the...
But that was a one-off, it was unusual.
Because there is I mean, that's the other thing. It's not just graphic novels. It's also, there's just a proliferation of artists and writers kind of producing sort of small press anthologies, and so there's so many kind of small book fairs now, and I mean, it really is incredible, and it's a way of much in the same as sort of fiction, kind of people contributing to short story anthologies and so on. It really is a way for young creators to getting known. Are there any comics people out here, by the way, comics creators? Or just no. You don't have to put your hand up. No, I'm just interested to know that, because it is entering short story competitions. There's a couple of kind of graphic short story competitions. The one that's run by Jonathan Cape. And it is a very kind of popular, that's how many people start off, and of course that's more publisher, it's a way of getting your work published without having to go to the expense of a complete novel.
Yeah, but there is a very thriving small press sort of industry in Britain, and this is anything from somebody. I think about a comic strip as opposed to a movie or something. Anybody, you can just, all you need is a sheet of paper and a pencil, and you can just do it. You can create all the sets and everything, and the costumes and stuff. But so there's everything from somebody who's sort of Xeroxed off, 100 copies of his comic, and he'll sell them at these fairs. All the way through to somebody who does something a bit more lavish and glossy and sell a few thousand, and everything in between. And they very often go to great lengths to personalise them and give them something special, like an embroidered cover or something like that. That's how a lot of people start these days in comics. And also there's web comics these days, which are a big growing thing. A lot of people can just do a comic strip and put it up on the internet, and it's either succeeds or it doesn't.
Yeah, and they gather momentum, and then they get get noticed from followers and get published in that way. I wanted to sort of go on to what you're going to be doing next. You're about to publish Granville, and then you're going to back to a collaboration together. Is that your next project? And can you give us a few hints? I know it's a couple of years down the line. Do you want to give a hint to anyone about?
I've started it. I've done about. I'm working on the first 10 pages at the moment.
It's another biography. It's about a real historical female character, a very, very, very key historical figure who people probably won't have heard of, and that's why I wanted to tell her story.
And is it kind of another like political, because this book is good because like politics is very much kind of key to what you've been doing, and I think that's the a very kind of moving thing about, well, I can't tell you the end of Sally Heathcote, because I don't want to, but there is there is a very kind of moving message in there when you get to the final page. Do you feel that having published this book in May and having had sort of 84.5% voter turnout for the Scottish referendum, do you think that was your book was anything to do with it? Do you think
probably
it had
not. Coincidental, I think.
But it's certainly, I think, kind of reading it and actually, you know, reminding people of the struggles that women had to go through in order to get the vote.
Well,
I mean, it's
people died to get the vote. You know,
yes.
We certainly hope it impresses upon people what women went through to get women the vote, and think maybe, okay, my ancestors are watching me, I need to vote.
Yeah. Is there any more question? Yes. You, lady in white here, I think.
What I've found about the graphic novel, having been an English teacher for many years, that graphic novels make a lot of literature that I've had to teach over the years to those kids who find reading difficult, that the graphic novel has helped build their confidence in reading.
Yeah,
because the pictures, like you were saying, you look at both, you skim both as you're reading, means that what they're reading is important. Whereas before, they always had the idea that comics were, oh, they'll put that in comic form for those children who are not very good at reading. But now, comic form has come into its own, and children find that, yeah, I know what's happening now. You know, I can read Midsummer Night's Dream in comic form and know what's happening. So it's a brilliant, brilliant form for those kinds of readers. And often they move on to reading ordinary novels, if you like.
Yeah, it's used in, comics are used in many countries around the world as part of literacy drives, because some people have trouble, getting into books and reading, and they're put off by these sort of blocks of cold print, whereas image is obviously a lot more accessible and draws you in a lot more. Yeah. But at this year's Lakes Festival, we're actually launching, announcing a new charity that's been set up this year. I'm one of the trustees, actually, and it's called Comics Literacy Awareness, and it's a charity to promote literacy through comics, through the comic medium. And we're going to be announcing the first comics laureate of Britain at the at the festival.
Yeah.
No, I'm a trustee. I can't really. No,
Does anyone else have a question? Yeah. Okay, well, I think just a big thanks to Charleston for having us, and a big thanks to Mary and to Bryan Talbot for giving us such a great presentation. Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, on behalf of Charleston, I'd like to thank you for coming to us. That's fantastic. It's been wonderful to hear about your collaborations, Mary and Bryan, and fantastically appropriate, I think, as we celebrate the short form that we're also looking at these fantastic graphic novel interpretations, and may there be many more of them. And also a huge thank you to Corinne for her fantastic chairing. It was a wonderful session, absolutely illuminating, and we hope you'll come back to us again soon. But in the meantime, thank you so much from all of us at Charleston for joining us.